Larry, we got jobs numbers out at the end of the week on Friday. Strong job numbers once again. Also, by the way, I should say, strong increases in wages. At the same time, it does raise the question whether this economy may be even more overheated than we thought.
Look, I think the single most important statistic for judging overheating is the ratio of vacancies to unemployment. And with these JOLTS numbers and these unemployment numbers, that statistic is going to be plumbing new highs when it's next calculated, and that suggests even more tightness in labor markets, and I think that points towards even more inflation. So I think near term we've got if anything, a bit greater inflation concern than we had before we saw these numbers. Of course, it's good that the economy is looking relatively strong. I think if you were in doubt as to whether the previous weakness was fundamental or was caused by Omicron, this would tend to tilt you towards thinking that it was caused by Omicron. But look, labor market indicators are always contemporaneous or lagging, so we don't know what the future holds, and certainly there are worrisome signs in terms of what's happening with consumer sentiment. But for now, I would say these are relatively inflationary numbers, and that's how markets look to be reading them, with significant movements towards yield curve inversion.
Larry, at the same time, you'd be the first to say these jobs numbers are good for the people who are getting jobs, and particularly some of the people at the lower end of the spectrum, which is something we should be concerned about. Is there no way that we can both take care of those people, make sure they're employed, that they are getting paid fairly, and not overheat the economy?
David, look, this is why the Earned Income Tax Credit is such a good idea. This is why I've supported increases in minimum wages. This is why we need stronger programs for people who don't go to college of many kinds. But we do not do anybody a favor by overheating the economy, because when we overheat the economy, the chickens do come home to roost at some point as the inflation has to leave the system. And so I think that this idea that we simply cheer on more and more employment without thinking about the inflationary consequences is like a doctor who celebrates the results of the prescription of their painkiller without thinking about what's going to come down the road. I think the Fed, too late, has awakened to that and is moving towards a strategy that is much more oriented towards tightening.
Larry, let's talk about those chickens maybe coming home to roost. There is talk about a possible recession here. You and I have talked about this at various times. I know you focused on historically one of the issues about the 4% number, under 4% unemployment, at the same time you have over 4% inflation. We also had the yield curve, the 2s, 10s yield curve invert a couple of times this week, including after the jobs numbers came out. Do you pay much attention to the yield curve at this point as a predictor of recession?
I look at it. I pay a little less attention to it than people in the markets do. And I think it's important to understand that it's not a causal relationship. If it exists, it's a canary in the coal mine kind of relationship. So it's not that changing the 10-year interest rate, if you could do it in some way, will change the prospect of recession. Rather, it's that when people are forecasting that the Fed is going to be cutting rates, they're also forecasting that that's going to happen because there's a recession. So it's a correlation thing, not a causation thing. I think that what's happening with the yield curve adds to a sense of economic anxiety that in situations like this, historically, we have not achieved soft landings, and we have seen recessions. Is it a certainty that we'll see a recession in the next 2 to 3 years? No. Is it more likely than not that we will see a recession in the next 2 years? I don't see how anybody can look at either the historical experience or what markets are predicting and not think that it's 50-50 better than 50-50, that a recession will start sometime within the next 2 years.
Larry, we also got the budget from the White House at the beginning of the week this week, and everybody agrees it's aspirational. What is sent out as the budget from the White House does not actually become law, but it does reflect values, as person after person from the White House reminds us. What are the values that you saw in President Biden's budget?
So I was glad to see increases in the defense budget. I was glad to see a substantial indicative commitment towards doing something about COVID. I was glad to see an emphasis on mental health as a theme in the budget. I was glad to see open-mindedness and open to complete negotiation on the remnants of Build Back Better, rather than re-prescribing all of that expenditure. Those were all, I thought, positive steps. I would have liked to see more realism on the tax side. I think the billionaires' tax is a bad idea whose time will never come. I think it's mislabeled to give it a kind of populist appeal relative to what's being proposed. I think the general idea of taxing capital gains when people don't have those capital gains and haven't sold the assets is not a realistic one. I think a much better strategy would have been to concentrate on a variety of loophole issues: capital gains at death, carried interest, which the administration has still not gotten done, changing like-kind exchanges for real estate. But the single most important thing, even if nothing else happens, is that the historic bit of economic diplomacy that Janet Yellen concluded on corporate tax with other countries is enabled by the necessary U.S. legislative action.
Larry, if you read the fact sheet put up by the White House earlier this week, they led with fiscal responsibility, the fact that they would be reducing the deficit. At the same time, if you look at the projection over the 10 years that they do for budgets, actually, as a percentage of GDP, the debt grows from something over 102% to something over 106%. Is that sustainable for the United States?
It's worse than that, David, because the interest rate forecasts in the president's budget look comical today in light of what's happened to interest rates. That's fair enough. They lock in those budget forecasts months in advance. But my guess is that if you used realistic forecasts, you'd add another 5% to the debt to GDP ratio. I suspect, given what's happening to interest rates, that there's going to be a need for more fiscal adjustment than the administration imagines. I suspect the administration has underestimated the national security expenditures that will be necessary going forward. And I think we're moving towards a moment when we're going to have to start thinking about fiscal policy as well as monetary policy as an anti-inflationary tool. So I think this is a beginning for budget discussions, not an end of budget discussions.
Well, it does strike me, Larry, you spent so much time in Washington. I haven't heard, I don't think, any politician draw that connection between taxes on the one hand and inflation on the other. Everybody's against taxes, everybody's against inflation, but I haven't heard anybody getting us ready for the fact that if you really don't like inflation, you may have to put up with more taxes.
You may have to put up with more taxes, or you may have to put up with some well-designed expenditure cuts. I don't think we're quite there at that point, but I think if we start having difficulty containing inflation, which I think is quite possible, or we find unacceptable, or the global economy finds unacceptable the magnitude of the interest rate increases that are necessary to contain inflation, then I think the whole issue of fiscal restraint may get back on the playing field. I don't think that's an issue for the next several months, but I think if one's thinking about where we're looking down the road, that's something we have to consider.